Good evening, everybody. Just as Tim was introducing me, it looked like the number of attendees in the room just crossed over 300, so that's great. And as Tim said, the subject of the presentation tonight is dealing with breakdown situations where when you're on a trip away from home and you have a mechanical problem with your airplane. The term of art for things like that every mechanic uses is AOG, or aircraft on ground. It's a term that has different meanings depending on the context. If you are shipping something AOG, it means you want it overnight. If you are ordering something AOG, it means you want it to be put at the head of the line and possibly expect to pay an extra AOG fee for priority processing. And when we call up a shop and tell them that we have an AOG situation, it means we want them to get right on it. So it generally has to do with the fact that an airplane is stuck somewhere it doesn't want to be, and we would like to do everything we can to get it unstuck as quickly as possible. Hang on for a second. All right, here we go. These mechanicals on the road are every aircraft owner's worst nightmare because you're stuck somewhere that you don't want to be. You're dependent on strangers, on shops and mechanics that you're not familiar with, and you really don't know how competent they are, or trustworthy they are. And generally you're outside your comfort zone. You're away from your hangar, from your toolbox, from your trusted mechanic, whatever the things are that make you comfortable when you're at home. All those things typically are missing when you have an airplane problem away from home. So generally these are the sorts of problems that make aircraft owners the most uncomfortable. My company manages the maintenance of about 500 owner-flown airplanes, plus or minus. On the average, we've done some research on this. Our clients, on the average, request breakdown assistance, by which I mean a breakdown away from home, about once every 2 years, plus or minus. So these things don't happen all that often to each person. But because we're managing about 500 aircraft, we have to deal with about 250 of these breakdowns away from home per year. So it means we have a lot of experience dealing with this stuff. Not quite one a week. Not quite one a day, but several of these a week we typically deal with. And after you've dealt with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these breakdowns, you start to learn a little bit about what the best way to handle them is. One of the things that I've learned is that when we rescue one of our clients from a breakdown away from home, it's the sort of thing that causes them to be very grateful. This is a quote from one of my clients who emailed me and said, "I always appreciate it when you save me thousands of dollars on my annual inspections and other routine maintenance, but when you help me out with that charging system failure during my recent fishing trip to Montana, that was truly priceless." So this is the sort of thing that owners take very seriously, and when we're helping owners with these situations, we take very seriously. Over years of dealing with hundreds and hundreds of these breakdown situations, I've developed a set of golden rules for how best to handle breakdowns away from home. And they're probably a little bit different than you might expect. But they're rules that we've kind of learned the hard way from experience. And normally the way I do these webinars is I typically will talk about a bunch of case studies, and at the end of the webinar I'll try to derive some lessons learned. But I'm going to do things a little bit reverse tonight. I'm going to tell you what the rules are up front. Then I'm going to tell you a few stories about breakdowns that we dealt with. actually 3 specific ones. Some that we didn't handle very well, and you always learn the most from the ones you screw up, obviously. Some that we handled very well, some that were easy to deal with, some that were pretty complicated to deal with. Just to sort of give you a cross-section of the sorts of things that happen in these breakdown away from home situations. And I think you'll find that these 3 case studies that I'm going to be going through with you tonight sort of illustrate some of these rules. But the basic 3 rules that I call the 3 golden rules of dealing with breakdowns away from home are these. The first rule is, when you have a problem on the road, don't put your airplane in the shop until you've diagnosed the problem, until you know what's wrong. Or, if you can't fully diagnose the problem, at least take the diagnosis as far as you can. The reason for that is, and you'll see this as we go through the examples, when you put your airplane in a strange shop and you're dealing with a strange mechanic, somebody that you don't know how competent he is, you don't know how honest he is, you don't know whether he is experienced with your make and model, you really don't want to be in a position where he is telling you what to do. You want to be in a position where you're telling him what to do. And the only way you can do that is to do some diagnostic work first, and then if the diagnosis indicates that it's a problem that has to be dealt with and needs to go into the shop, then put the airplane in the shop, but you'll be in a position to basically tell the shop or the mechanic what it is you need done. So rule 1, don't put your airplane in the shop until you've either diagnosed the problem or gone as far towards the diagnosis as you can. Rule 2, don't perform maintenance away from home base if you can possibly avoid it. The first thing that you always want to do when you have a problem away from home, obviously the first thing is to try to diagnose it as best you can, and then make a decision as to whether the problem is a safety of flight problem or not. If it is not a safety of flight problem, then fly home and deal with it when you get home. Only if it is a problem that affects safety of flight should you be trying to fix it while you're away from home. And in my experience, having done hundreds and hundreds of these, we have a rule of thumb that about half the time a client calls in AOG and asks for breakdown assistance, we review the symptoms, we diagnose the problem, and about half the time we say it's okay to fly home that way. We'll deal with it when you get back. So anytime we can safely avoid doing maintenance away from home, that's what we always suggest. We don't want to be doing maintenance away from home if we don't absolutely have to. Again, as you go through these case studies I will be going through with you, you'll understand why, the reason behind this rule. And the third rule is, if maintenance away from home is unavoidable because there is a safety of flight issue involved, then do the absolute minimum maintenance necessary to fly home safely and defer everything else. We want to avoid doing maintenance away from home if we can, and if we can't avoid it, we want to keep it to an absolute minimum. Pretty simple rules. And so let me give you a few case studies so that you can understand why we do things this way. And the first 2 case studies that I'm going to talk about both have to do with Cirrus SR-22s, actually turbo-normalized Cirrus SR-22s. My company manages about 8% of all the Cirruses in the United States, so a lot of the breakdown issues that we deal with are with Cirrus airplanes. And the 2 cases I'm going to tell you about involve 2 quite late model, in fact so late model that they were both under warranty at the time, SR-22 turbo-normalized airplanes, both of which broke down in Florida, about 200 nautical miles apart, a week apart. One we didn't handle so well. One we handled beautifully. And I'm going to tell you both of those stories so that you can see the difference. And we don't always handle things right. We make mistakes like everybody else, and we tend to learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes, just like everybody else. So the first story I want to tell you about has to do with an SR-22 2010 model owned by a fellow by the name of Kevin Brady. Kevin called us, said he was AOG stuck at Kissimmee, Florida, down near Orlando. He had flown down there with his family, wife and kids, for a couple of days at Disney World. And during the flight down from his home base in Arkansas, he was flying at flight level 190 and suddenly experienced a 10-inch loss of manifold pressure. The airplane normally runs at about roughly 30 inches of manifold pressure. It's a turbocharged airplane, turbo-normalized airplane. And all of a sudden, about 2/3 of the way to Kissimmee, suddenly the engine lost power, and he noticed that manifold pressure, instead of being 30 inches, was suddenly 20 inches. When he called, he mentioned that the airplane had just the week before come out of its annual inspection at a big Cirrus authorized service center near Nashville, Tennessee, which is the shop that he normally used for his maintenance. Here's what his MFD looked like, and you can see that the manifold pressure gauge that has the red arrow pointing to it is showing about 20 inches of manifold pressure. It should be right up at the top of the green, but it's suddenly about 2/3 of the way down to Kissimmee, it suddenly dropped. In fact, he mentioned that the engine suddenly started acting as if it were normally aspirated instead of turbocharged. When that happened, he called ATC, asked for a lower altitude, and the engine seemed to be running okay, except that it just acted like suddenly it wasn't turbocharged anymore. So instead of putting the airplane down immediately, he decided that it was okay to continue on to his destination of Kissimmee. And when he got on the ground and unloaded his family and his luggage and so on, he called us and said, "I got a problem." Now, when he described the symptoms, we were about 95% sure we knew what was wrong. And the reason we were about 95% sure we knew what was wrong was because we'd seen exactly this same situation dozens of times before on turbo-normalized Cirruses right after they came out of annual. And the problem that we had seen dozens of times before, and we were pretty darn sure that that was his problem, was what's illustrated in the picture. When you do an annual inspection on one of these airplanes, one of the things that you have to do is remove the intercoolers in order to gain access to the rear spark plugs and a bunch of other stuff. And at the end of the annual, when they're putting the airplane back together, they reassemble the intercoolers, and they have to hook up these red flexible induction couplings that are held on with 2 stainless steel hose clamps. And it turns out that unless you are very careful at positioning those induction tubes just right and tightening the hose clamp on the correct side of that little bead, it looks like you got the induction coupling on, but as soon as the turbocharger starts pressurizing that duct, it blows the thing right off, and all of a sudden you've lost all your turbocharging, and the airplane suddenly acts like it's normally aspirated. So we were almost sure, just from Kevin's description and our past experience with these airplanes, and having seen this exact problem numerous times right after an airplane got out of annual inspection, that this was what was wrong with the airplane. But unfortunately, in aviation, 95% isn't enough. We still felt that there was a small but finite probability that it was something else. And that something else could be seriously dangerous. For example, the loss of manifold pressure could be caused by a big exhaust leak. And a big exhaust leak is about the most dangerous thing that can happen in a turbocharged airplane because it can set the airplane on fire. So even though we were 95% sure we knew what was wrong, we weren't willing to take the risk of saying, Kevin, it's okay to fly home that way. We decided that we really needed to have an A&P take a look at it. And hopefully it'll turn out to be that induction coupling. It'll take 15 minutes to fix. He'll be good to go. And we'd be able to sleep at night. So we looked at a map, and there were 2 Cirrus service centers in the general vicinity of Kissimmee. The nearest one was at Orlando. There was one a little further away at Tampa. Kevin decided he'd rather go to the closer one. So we called up the shop in Orlando. We said, we've got an airplane with an emergency. Could you squeeze him into the schedule? They said, sure, bring it over. Kevin flies the airplane 10 minutes to the nearest Cirrus service center in Orlando. And the service center inspects Kevin's engine, and they can't find anything wrong. In fact, we told them what we thought was probably wrong was a loose induction coupling at one of the intercoolers. They couldn't find anything wrong. Then something bad happened. The director of maintenance at the service center noticed that Kevin's airplane is still under warranty. And so he took it upon himself to call Cirrus and say, we've got a 2010 Cirrus SR-22 still under warranty, got this problem, we can't find anything wrong, and before you know it, Cirrus has arranged to ship a new wastegate and a new turbo controller overnight, about $5,000 worth of stuff under warranty. Whereupon the shop starts taking Kevin's exhaust system apart. He didn't tell Kevin, he didn't tell us, he just started taking the airplane apart. The next day, the FedEx guy shows up first thing in the morning with the new wastegate, the new turbo controller, and they install the new wastegate, they install the new turbo controller, they take the airplane up on a test flight, and it's still the same as it was. Didn't help a bit. Now, had they consulted with us, first of all, we would have told them not to do it because the symptoms were not consistent with a problem with either a wastegate or a turbo controller. But they didn't tell us. They just went ahead and did it. So at this point, they call up Kevin and they explain what's happened, that they ordered all this stuff and they've taken the airplane apart and they put it back together and they took it up for test flight and it still doesn't work. And Kevin is getting very upset. First of all, he and his family now have been stuck in Orlando for way longer than they planned. He's missed an important business meeting. At one point he hollers, who's going to pay for this? And then he gets even more upset when he learns that the service center test flew his airplane without his permission, because Kevin is one of those guys who doesn't let anyone else fly his airplane but himself. And I understand that because I'm the same way. Nobody is allowed to fly my airplane except me. And so he is now doubly upset with the shop. First of all, for taking apart his airplane and putting it back together without asking him. And second of all, for allowing somebody to test fly it without his permission. So ultimately, the service center pulls its chief inspector off annualing another airplane and asks him to inspect Kevin's airplane and see if the chief inspector can find out what's wrong. Three guesses what he finds. Exactly what we told him was wrong. He found a loose induction coupling at the intercooler that the first mechanic, who was not nearly a senior, apparently overlooked. So, some observations about what happened here. And this obviously didn't go very well. The service center was totally fixated on fixing the airplane, and it never considered Kevin's needs or wants. The service center assumed it could do whatever work it chose to do on the airplane because it was in warranty and Kevin wasn't going to have to pay for it. Bad assumptions. The service center assumed it could test fly Kevin's airplane without asking his permission. Again, that infuriated Kevin. But this sort of decision-making is stuff that we see all the time, because mechanics tend to fixate on the airplane, not on the airplane owner. And that turns out to almost always be the wrong thing. The service center in general assumed that Kevin would be thrilled that they fixed his airplane. But instead, Kevin was furious that the service center did all of this stuff, including flying his airplane, without his permission. And because they did all of this stuff that they weren't authorized to do, he and his whole family wound up being stuck in Florida for a week with that they hadn't planned on. So we learned some lessons. We screwed up by, not intentionally, but inadvertently giving the service center essentially a blank check to troubleshoot the airplane. What we should have done, and we all of us on the Savvy team had a meeting after this to discuss this. We should have instructed the service center something like, please spend no more than 2 hours troubleshooting this issue and then report your findings. And under no circumstances do anything that grounds the aircraft. Had we been smart enough to tell the shop that, then all this other stuff wouldn't have happened, and Kevin would have been a much happier camper. But we made a mistake, and we learned a big lesson from that. The objective should not have been to fix the plane. It should have been to get Kevin and his family home safely as soon as possible. And we have a slogan for that: owner first, airplane second. Mechanics tend to fixate on the airplane. We try very hard, and we didn't do a very good job this time, but we try very hard to fixate on the owner. What are the owner's needs? What is it going to take to make the owner happy? Not to make the airplane happy, but to make the owner happy. 1 week later, about 200 nautical miles to the northwest, Gary Troop has a 2009, almost an identical airplane, 1 year earlier model, again under warranty. And he calls in, and he is AOG in Tallahassee, Florida. He was about to launch for his home base in Destin, Florida, not terribly far away, and discovered he can't get the engine started. We asked him for the symptoms. He said when he tries to crank the engine, he can hear the starter making noise, but the prop only twitches and won't really turn over. That is the classic symptom, so we immediately diagnosed the problem as a slipping starter drive adapter. On Continental engines, the starter drive adapter is the thing that sits between the starter motor and the crankshaft. It's essentially a clutch assembly that couples the starter motor to the crankshaft when you're cranking the engine, and then decouples the starter motor from the crankshaft when the engine starts. And it's called a starter drive adapter. That picture's what it looks like. So as soon as we tell Gary that his problem is a slipping starter drive adapter, he says, "Oh, fine. There's a service center here on the field at Tallahassee. He'll call them, have them tow the airplane over, and replace the starter drive adapter under warranty." The natural reaction that almost any owner would have under these circumstances. We say, "No, Gary, do not do that." because we happen to know that Continental is 10 days back ordered on starter drive adapters. And if he puts his airplane in the shop and says change the starter drive adapter, his airplane is going to probably spend 2 weeks in Tallahassee. And we don't want Gary to be stuck in Tallahassee because we're owner first and airplane second. So instead, we tell Gary to call the FBO and ask them to bring over their 28-volt ground power unit. Because we know from experience that when a Continental starter drive adapter starts to slip during normal starts on the ship's battery, which is a 24-volt battery, it's still usually good for a few more starts if you hook up the airplane to 20 to 28 volts, where the starter motor has a little bit more oomph. And so we explained to him that if he can get the FBO to hook his airplane up to a 28-volt cart, that there's an excellent chance that he'll be able to get the airplane started. He'll be able to fly home to Destin. He was trying to get home in time for dinner. And then we can deal with the starter adapter problem back at his home base, where everything is a lot more comfortable for everybody. So the next thing that happens about 20 minutes later is Gary phones us from the cockpit on his cell phone. We can hear the engine noise in the background. He said the engine started fine on 28 volts. He's about to launch for home. As soon as we get off the phone with Gary, we contact his home service center in Destin, ask them to order a replacement starter drive adapter, and Gary makes it home for dinner, and everybody's happy. So again, this one was a textbook case of owner first, airplane second. The owner's natural impulse was to put the airplane in the shop. But we knew if he put the airplane in the shop, he wasn't going to be happy because his airplane was going to be tied up for 2 weeks, and he was going to be stuck away from home and having to find some alternate means of transportation to get home, and then alternate means of transportation to get back to pick up his airplane 2 weeks later. And so instead of focusing on fixing the airplane, we focused on getting Gary home, and it had a happy ending. Fast forward to last Saturday. And this is the third story I'll tell you. This one's a little bit longer because it got a little bit more complicated. Actually, this is a pretty hairy one. But again, it illustrates a lot of important issues with regard to breakdowns away from home. And this is a story about a Cessna 185, a 1980 Cessna A185, owned by a fellow by the name of Mark Belacco, who lives up in the San Francisco Bay Area, bases his airplane at a little airport called Byron up in the Bay Area. And he flew his airplane. He and his wife flew the airplane from his home near San Francisco, or the home base airport, to Minden, Nevada, up in the high Sierras, a little bit south of Reno, to take care of his sick mom who lives up there. A few days later, they went back to the airport, got in the airplane, and when he started the engine to depart for home, there was no oil pressure. This is not a good way to start a trip home. There was only one A&P mechanic on the field at Minden, so Mark called him. They took the airplane over to his shop. The A&P hooked up an external pressure gauge to the engine and started it again briefly and verified that there was really no oil pressure. It wasn't just the gauge that wasn't working, which I could have told him because the gauges in the Cessna 185 are old style direct reading gauges where there's actually an oil line that runs right into the cockpit and hooks to the back of the gauge, and there's no electrons, there's no sensors, there's no connectors or wiring harnesses, and those old direct reading gauges never lie. If they say there's no oil pressure, you can take it to the bank that there's no oil pressure. Anyway, the A&P verified that there really was no oil pressure. He then proceeded to cut open the oil filter and told Mark that there was significant bearing metal in the filter, that was a direct quote, and that his engine would need to be torn down. The A&P then disappeared into his office for a few minutes and emerged with a written estimate for engine removal, teardown, and reinstallation that totaled something north of $10,000. Mark is having a really bad day now, and he decided to email me. And fortunately, I was checking my email pretty compulsively that morning, and I saw his email literally within minutes of the time he sent it to me. So I emailed him back and I said, Mark, I said, could you take some photos with your iPhone of the metal that this mechanic saw in the oil filter, and send the photos to me so that I can get some idea of what this mechanic is seeing in your oil filter. Significant bearing material, metal in the oil filter. So a few minutes later, I get an email back from Mark with some pictures, nice pictures of the oil filter. Took a nice close look at them. Filter looked pretty clean to me. Looked at another picture and magnified it way up. I saw a few little flecks of metal, but nothing that I would call significant. We have rules of thumb about how much metal in a filter is important and what you do. And in fact, my webinar next month is exactly on this subject. We'll get into a lot of detail about when you find metal in the filter, exactly what you do. But in any case, I looked at the photos that Mark sent me of this filter, and I went back to him and I said, sure doesn't look like significant metal to me. So I started asking him some questions. I said, are you sure there's oil in the sump? He said, yep. First thing he did was check the dipstick, and there was plenty of oil. I said, well, if you've got plenty of oil in the sump, there's about a 95% chance, here we go again, that the reason that you don't have any oil pressure is because there's some contamination in your oil pressure relief valve. Oil pressure relief valve is a little spring-loaded thing that sits on the back of the oil pump, and its purpose is to regulate oil pressure. And if some foreign material somehow gets into the oil pressure relief valve and prevents the plunger from sealing properly against the seat, it's a little steel, spring-loaded steel plunger that sits against a brass seat, and if there's any foreign material in there that prevents the valve from fully closing, then you won't get any oil pressure when you start the engine. And even if you ran the engine up to high RPM, you would get some oil pressure, but you wouldn't get an appropriate amount. Obviously, when you start an engine and if you don't see any oil pressure, you're not going to be running it up to high RPM unless you're pretty dumb. But so I said, you know, I'll bet you steak dinner that the reason you don't have any oil pressure is because there's some little piece of something in your oil pressure relief valve. So I suggested that Mark have the A&P remove the housing from the oil pressure relief valve and inspect it and see if there's some sort of foreign material in there that would account for these symptoms. Short time later, he emails me back. I think by now he's texting me. And he sends me a picture and says, you're absolutely right. We found a little piece of metal lodged in the pressure relief valve, and here it is. And the mechanic said, well, this is just one more indication that we need to tear down this engine. Something is coming apart big time. So I took a look at the piece of metal, and I asked Mark some questions. I said, is it ferrous or non-ferrous? He said, how do I know? I said, take a magnet and see whether it sticks to a magnet or not. Texted me back and he said, it does not stick to a magnet. It is non-ferrous. I said, it looks kind of silvery in the picture. Do you agree? Is it silvery or is it coppery colored? He said, oh, it's silvery colored. I said, well, if it's non-ferrous and it's silvery, pretty much the only thing that can be is a little piece of aluminum. And I said, I said, I'm not concerned about a little isolated piece of aluminum. And I said, unless there are a bunch of its brothers and sisters floating around in your oil pan. I said, but it's just one little piece of aluminum like that. I wouldn't be too concerned. The A&P, of course, is still insisting that the engine needs to be torn down, and Mark is starting to panic, and he texts me, Mike, what can I do? Can this A&P ground my airplane? Can he hold it hostage until I agree to the $10,000 plus teardown? One of the things I find a lot in these breakdown away from home situations is that owners get very emotional and get very frightened. Again, they're dealing with strangers, and in this case, dealing with a stranger who wants to have the airplane for a month or two and charge them over $10,000 to fix it. So I told Mark not to panic. I asked him a few more questions, and one of the things I learned was that he was pretty handy with tools, and he was one of those aircraft owners that was used to doing his own oil changes and other preventive maintenance. And I said, this is a good situation. So I suggested to Mark that he tell the A&P to put the airplane back together, get a logbook entry for the work that the A&P had performed so far, pay the A&P's bill, and get the plane out of there before the A&P took anything else apart. Because this A&P was clearly bound and determined to tear down this engine. And from everything that I was seeing, there was no earthly reason to do that. So Mark did what I told him, told the A&P to put the airplane back together, give him a logbook entry, give him an invoice that he would pay. The mechanic was not very happy about this. He gave Mark a rather nasty logbook entry. I don't know if you can read this, but the last some of what it says in there is found large ferrous chunk on relief valve seat, and Mark had verified that it was non-ferrous, and I could tell it wasn't large. And he said that he found significant metal contamination, including fine bearing material and ferrous particles. And again, I looked at high-resolution photos, and as far as I was concerned, the amount of metal in the filter was totally insignificant. We'll talk about that in next month's webinar. And he says, owner advised of engine condition, engine ground run by owner, because the mechanic refused even to run the airplane on the ground. He was basically saying, I'm not taking responsibility for this thing. So the logbook entry is kind of nasty, and it basically said, I told him not to run the engine, but he did it anyway. Now, let me just point out that mechanics are not supposed to do that. The regulation that defines what is supposed to be in a logbook entry, which is FAR 43.9, says that a logbook entry is supposed to contain only the date, the mechanic's signature, and, quote, a description of the work performed. It is not supposed to talk about any discrepancies found. It's not supposed to contain any editorial comments. It's just supposed to talk about a description of the work performed. Some A&Ps can't resist in making editorial comments. Mark was kind of upset about this logbook entry. I told him, don't worry about it. Just pay his bill, get the airplane out of there, and then we'll deal with the problem once we get it out of this shop. Also, this wonderful mechanic insisted on being paid with a cashier's check. So poor Mark's wife had to run into town and go to the bank and get a cashier's check to pay this mechanic. But at any rate, finally, the airplane was out of jail. Mark started the engine, gave it a brief run-up. The oil pressure was now just fine. I had no doubt about that because we found why the oil pressure was zero. We had a little piece of foreign material in the pressure relief valve. With the foreign material removed, the oil pressure was fine. In fact, the oil pressure was actually a little bit above the top of the green because the engine was because the oil was cold. But as the oil warmed up, the oil pressure went right to about 50 psi, right where it's supposed to be, right about 2/3 of the way up the green arc. So I had Mark taxi over to the FBO, and then I asked him to drain the oil, which was now nice and warm, through several layers of cheesecloth in order to find out whether there were any more chunks of metal floating around in the oil pan. You remember the brothers and sisters I was talking about. So he drains the oil through this cheesecloth, which is sort of a messy procedure, but it needed to be done. And he carefully inspected the cheesecloth and determined that there was nothing but cheesecloth and oil there. There was no metal, which was what I was hoping to find. At this point, I had Mark service the engine with fresh oil, and then go out and perform a 30-minute ground run, varying the RPM between idle and 1700 RPM, which is the normal run-up RPM for Continental engine. And to do that for about 30 minutes. The oil pressure was perfect and nice and steady. And when he reported that, I said, okay, now go down to the end of the long runway, which is at Minden is 7,400 feet long, and go to full power and do a high-speed taxi test down the runway, kind of a rejected takeoff, so that we can make sure that everything works fine even at full power. I don't like to do full power run-ups, static run-ups, because it's very hard on the engine, but so I had him do it while he was rolling down this long runway. And he said everything was fine, and finally I had him taxi back to the FBO. He's texting me like crazy from the cell phone while he's doing all this stuff. And shut down the engine, take off the cowl, and cut open the oil filter. And tell me if he finds any metal in the oil filter. And so he did, and he inspected the filter carefully, and he sent me pictures of it, and the filter was absolutely spotless. No metal in it whatsoever. Obviously, it was a nice light color because the oil in it only had about 40 minutes on it, but there was no residual metal either in the cheesecloth, which would catch the big stuff, or the filter, which would catch little stuff. Everything was just clean as a whistle. At this point, I said to Mark I was now comfortable with his flying airplane and wanted to make sure that he was comfortable. He said he was. So we decided to fly up the valley to Carson City Airport to spend the night, which he did. The flight was uneventful. The oil pressure was rock solid. And then first thing the next morning, he took off from Carson City, crossed the Sierras, following I-80 just to be on the safe side, and he continued home in the Bay Area. The engine performed flawlessly. When he got home, he cut the oil filter again, and it still was clean as a whistle. And that was the end of the story. So, again, owner first, airplane second, and Mark was a very happy camper. At any rate, I think this sort of illustrates some of the things I'm talking about. Again, the 3 rules: don't put your airplane in the shop until you diagnose the problem. Of course, Mark immediately put it in the shop, which is what most owners just reflexively do, but you don't want to do that. You want to figure out what's wrong before you put it in the shop. I mean, he called me. I diagnosed it, within 30 seconds, and he could have done that before putting it in the shop and not having to go through all of this agony. Rule 2, don't perform maintenance away from home base if you possibly could avoid it. In this case, he actually couldn't avoid it because somebody had to clean out the pressure relief valve. And although Mark was very handy with tools, it's technically not legal for a non-A&P to do that. There's a lot of everything I asked Mark to do was legal for an owner to do as preventive maintenance. But opening up the pressure relief valve is not something that an owner is allowed to do, so you need to get an A&P. But in a perfect world, he would have taken it into the shop and asked the mechanic, please open up the pressure relief valve and inspect it for foreign material, and would have hopefully limited the mechanic's involvement to doing exactly that. And rule 3 is, if maintenance is unavoidable, do the absolute minimum necessary to fly home safely, which is precisely what we did. We kept what the mechanic did to a minimum, although the mechanic obviously wanted to do the maximum, and got the airplane out of there just as quick as we could. So that's it. Looks like we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, Tim. And just quickly, these are the my maintenance webinars that we'll be doing every month for up till the end of the year. And you'll see that the one next month on June 5th is specifically on the subject of what to do when we find metal in the oil filter. And I think you'll find it interesting. You got a little taste of it with Mark's situation, but we're going to spend a whole webinar talking about exactly how we handle those situations. So with that, Tim, why don't we do the Q&A, and I will leave my email address up so that anybody who has a question that we don't have time for tonight, or if a question occurs to you later after we get done, feel free to email me at the email address that is on the screen now, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Excellent. Oh, good presentation, Mike. Thank you.
I haven't done this one before. I didn't know how long it would take, but we actually got through it pretty quickly. So.
Yeah, great timing. We do have a few questions that have come in, so let me dive right into them here. Eric is wondering, he says a 30-minute ground run for Mark's engine. He's wondering how long can an engine be safely ground run without overheating?
Well, that's the reason that I, first of all, told him not to run the engine more than 1,700 RPM, which is the normal, continental run-up RPM. I didn't want him to be pulling a lot of power. And second of all, that I told him not to run it continuously for 30 minutes, 1,700 RPM, but to alternate between 1,700 RPM and idle so that the airplane would have, the engine would have a chance to cool down. I did want to get at least some running at full power, but I don't ever want to do that in a static situation, because there's basically, if you're sitting there with the brakes locked, there's really hardly any cooling air going over the cylinders. So after we ascertained as much as we could from the ground run, which probably never exceeded about, I don't know, 40% power, I had him do a full power run, but do it on the roll on this long runway, so that the airplane was moving and at least some reasonable amount of cooling air was passing over the cylinders.
Got it. Okay. Steve says, where or how did Mark get all the tools to do the requested checkout stuff on the engine?
Well, I sort of asked him that, and it turns out, oddly enough, that years ago he had read an article that I had written that was published, I think, on AvWeb, and is probably still there. It was an article called "The Traveling Toolbox" that suggested what sort of tools a wrench-friendly owner who likes to do their own preventive maintenance and stuff might want to carry in the airplane. And darn, he took it literally, and he made himself up a toolbox. And this was part of the Q&A that I went through with him before recommending that he pull the airplane out of the shop and do the rest himself, because this mechanic clearly was dead set on pulling this engine out of the airplane and tearing it down. And when it became apparent to me that Mark could do everything that we needed to do himself, and that everything we needed to do was something that was absolutely legal for him as a non-A&P but an aircraft owner, that's when I made the decision to have him do that.
Great idea, and good advice. We did have a message here from Carl. He was wondering, what sort of tools and spares should he carry on a cross country? So maybe a good idea to try and look up that article.
Yeah, I believe if you Google something, I think the title of it was "The Traveling Toolbox," and if you Google Bush, B-U-S-C-H, or Mike Bush and Traveling Toolbox, I bet you'll get a hit on it. What you carry in the airplane depends on a number of things. It really depends on, first of all, what kind of airplane you're flying. Second of all, how ambitious you are, what sorts of tasks you're likely to be willing to take on yourself. And it also has to do with the useful load of your airplane. I carry a lot more stuff in my twin than most people would carry in most singles, because I've got a lot of baggage room and a lot of weight carrying capability. But you know, for example, for many years I owned a Cessna 182, and it was an older Cessna 182. It's actually a 68 model that I bought new in 1968, but it's older now. And at the time, in 1968, Cessna was using mechanical voltage regulators, not solid state ones. And the mechanical voltage regulators had like oscillating contacts and stuff. They were very troublesome, and my 182 just would go through voltage regulators like crazy. So I decided after the third time I lost a voltage regulator and wound up spending a night on a hard wooden bench somewhere because I couldn't get a voltage regulator or a mechanic until the next day, that I would buy a spare voltage regulator, carry it around in the airplane with me as a spare. Of course, you know that once I did that, I never had another alternate or a regulator failure again. Spare parts have that effect. They radiate a magic force field, and the act of carrying a spare almost guarantees that you won't use it. In my twin Cessna, I don't carry spare regulators because they're solid state and they never fail. But I carry typically 4 spare spark plugs because I've got 24 of them in the airplane, and sometimes they get fouled or they get something goes wrong with the spark plug. One of the things my twin Cessna does, it doesn't go through regulators, but boy, it sure goes through vacuum pumps. So I always carry a spare vacuum pump in the airplane, and I carry a little trick 7/8 inch wrench so that I can change the vacuum pump wherever I am. And I've changed the vacuum pump in very weird places. So it really depends on what airplane you're flying, what your history of failures are. I mean, for example, I also always carry a spare taxi bulb and a spare landing light bulb because those things fail a lot, and it takes about 15 minutes to change them out. So I carry one of each in the airplane. How ambitious you are with tools and that sort of thing. And like I say, if you look up that article called The Traveling Toolbox, it'll give you a lot of ideas about what sorts of things you might want to carry.
Awesome. And a number of the attendees did do a Google search
How do
as
you
you
know?
were talking, and it was
Did
the
they
traveling.
find it?
Yeah, they found it. It was called the Traveling Toolkit, and it's on
Toolkit.
Yep, Traveling Toolkit. It's www.avweb.com/news/maint .maint/182906-1.html.
Now you took all the fun out of it.
Oh, I know. avweb.com news maint, and it's a number 182906-1.
And
Thanks for all you folks for looking that up and typing that in to share with everybody.
I don't know what the date is. I bet I wrote that article sometime in the late 90s, but it's amazing how stuff on the internet just stays there forever.
Yeah, interesting comment about as soon as you carry a spare, you never have a failure of that item. All the more reason to carry that spare, isn't it?
That's absolutely, you betcha.
Yeah, you got it.
And there's total truth to that.
Okay, so Ray is wondering, what if we're not a savvy client? Okay to call your home mechanic for advice and counsel?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, Mark was not only not a savvy client, but I never heard of him before. He was a total stranger. And when he called me, the first question he asked me was, he kind of explained his predicament, and he said, would it be okay if I signed up for your program? And I said to him, never mind that. Let's get you home. Then we can talk about signing up for the Savvy program. And I just immediately started focusing on helping him out. I'm a total sucker for helping out aircraft owners in distress. So, um, but no, you don't have to be a savvy client to call me.
Cool. Well, that's great.
Although,
You know, it
although
takes the
I certainly would appreciate it if you'd consider joining the program. But you absolutely don't feel obligated. I help hundreds and hundreds of aircraft owners. It gives me a lot of pleasure to do it. I mean, that's why I write my articles. That's why I do these webinars. That's why I'm going to do, what is it, something like 12 Forum Plaza presentations at AirVenture this year.
wow.
I do it because I enjoy it. So don't ever hesitate.
Awesome. Well, thank you on behalf of everyone.
Now you will
Thank you
notice that
for that.
you will notice that I did not put my phone number on the screen. I put my email address on the screen. And he did email me, and I subsequently transitioned to texting him. I never actually did talk to him. Now that I think of it, it was all done by email and then by text.
Modern technology.
And I never actually spoke to him. I don't know what his voice sounds like.
So Mark is wondering what was the chunk in Mark's plane? What do you believe the metal chunk was from?
Now wait a
under the
minute.
pressure relief valve.
Is this the Mark or a different Mark?
Well, good question.
Well, I don't know what it was. It was a little isolated piece of aluminum, but as long as, like I said, as long as it didn't have a lot of brothers and sisters, I don't really care where it came from.
Yeah.
You know, but engines just, you know, shed little pieces of metal all the time. As long as you're not shedding a lot, it's no big deal. It's just a transient event. That's why we went to such lengths to make sure that there was just that one little guy and not, you know, 100 of them.
Right.
And had the cheesecloth been full of little aluminum granules, I would have our thing would have had a very gone in a very different way.
Sure. Yeah. You don't want to fly over the Sierras after having found that, do you?
But you know, and if you want to know what would have happened if that cheesecloth had a bunch of metal, my next plan, because I always try to, you know, it's kind of like a chess game. I always try to be a couple of moves ahead. Would be to call up mechanic at Carson City and ask him to drive down, because I sure as hell wasn't going to send Mark back to this guy who had absolutely fixated that he was going to tear down the engine. We want to go through, and again, the details of exactly what we would do, I don't want to go into because that's what next month's webinar is about. But we probably would have sent the metal off to a lab for scanning electron microscope analysis and determine exactly where it was coming from, and so on. There's a whole diagnostic procedure we go through when we find metal in the oil in order to decide what the appropriate action is. And, you know, sometimes we do have to tear down an engine, but we sure as hell don't want to do it unless it's absolutely necessary.
Right, right. Well, here's one that's going to really freak you out. We got a comment here.
I'm from the FAA and you're busted.
No. He said, okay, this was close to 40 years ago. When I was a relatively new pilot, I flew a rental 172 with an 0300 across town to another airport. When I started the engine to fly back, I noticed no oil pressure. So I went to the office and called the owner of the rental plane. He asked me to fly it back across town because he was sure it was something to do with the oil pressure sender. I knew little about mechanics then, so I told him I think the FAA would have an issue if your engine seized over the middle of the city. He was quite aggravated that he had to drive across town. Now that I wonder what it was that the pressure, now that I know it was probably the pressure relief valve. Surely no one in their right mind would take off with no oil pressure.
Well, nobody in his right mind would take off with no oil pressure. But tell me again what type and year of airplane it was.
It was. It just says a rental 172 with an 0300.
Okay.
Continental 0300.
Back when 172s had 0300s, oil pressure gauges did not have senders. They were like the oil pressure gauge that was in this 185. The oil actually was piped right into the cockpit and hooked right to the back of the gauge. Those gauges, those direct reading gauges that have an oil line hooked right to the back of them, are called Bourdon tube gauges, and they literally are failure proof. there is nothing that can go wrong with that gauge. I mean, short of bursting and putting oil all over your toes or something like that. But if a board and tube gauge says there's no oil pressure, you can take it to the bank that there's no oil pressure. Now, on our modern newfangled airplanes, it's all different. They've got sensors, they've got wiring, they've got connectors, they've got way more electrons than are any good. And a lot of time when we see anomalous engine readings, they are instrumentation problems rather than real engine problems, and so we have to go through a bunch of diagnostic stuff to determine whether the problem is real or not. But in an old 172 with an 0300, that had the same exact gauge on it that this 185 had on it, and that gauge never lies.
Yeah. So Carl has another question.
So the owner of the rental 172 is an idiot. Yes.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And good for you for standing your ground and not flying an aircraft with no oil pressure.
You bet.
Even as a young, inexperienced pilot, there's some things that just have common sense come into play, and that's one of them, obviously.
One of the great, I don't like flying rental airplanes because it's a good way to fall out of the sky, but one of the advantages of flying rental airplanes is if something goes wrong, it ain't your problem.
Right.
You call the owner, you get on an airline, and it's his problem.
Carl's wondering about tires. He says, we fly from an area that is sticker prone. Would it be okay to slime the tube tires?
Slime?
I think I
know.
One of those cans
kind
of slime
you
that you
mean.
put in to try and seal up a leaking tire.
Well, it certainly isn't legal on a certificated airplane. So as they say in the maintenance world, if you do it, for God's sake, don't log it.
Mm-hmm. He's probably using an experimental. He's probably talking experimental.
If it's an experimental, I offhand can't think of any harm in doing that. But on the other hand, aircraft tires are so tough that those stickers would have to be real Modicker stickers to get all the way through a tire and puncture the tube. That's a little hard for me to imagine.
Dave is wondering, is there any way to find top-rated mechanics at different airports?
Well, I hate to toot my own horn, but that's one of the things that we do for our Savvy clients. We have a huge database of shops all over the country, actually all over the world, because we do manage airplanes in a bunch of other countries, although the majority of the airplanes we manage are in the U.S. We even have a proprietary Google Map application so that if a client calls in and he says, I'm AOG in Sheep Dip, Nebraska, I can pull up a map, type in Sheep Dip, Nebraska, and it will draw a 200 nautical mile reference circle, show me all the shops in that within that circle, and color code them green, yellow, or red. The greens mean this is a shop we've worked with before and it's really good. Red means this is a shop we've worked with before and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. And yellow is somewhere in between. So, but obviously we can't publish that. If we ever published our shop ratings, like some kind of good housekeeping seal of approval, anybody that wasn't on our good housekeeping list would be very ticked off at us. And because we never know where one of our clients is going to wind up breaking down, we can't afford to alienate anybody, even the not so good shops. So but at any rate, that is one of the things that we do for our clients, is we keep very close tabs on who the best and the worst shops are, and we try very hard to steer them toward the good ones and away from the bad ones.
Okay, so here's the million-dollar question then. Steve says, what would have been the course of action if Mark had not have the tools and the ability to do what you asked him to do?
Well, as I said, once I determined that it was very unlikely that a teardown was appropriate, and that this particular mechanic was absolutely bound and determined that that nothing but a teardown was going to satisfy him, I had no choice but to recommend that Mark get the airplane out of there. And if he had not been able to do the follow-on stuff himself, even though it was all preventive maintenance and so on, the next step would have been to call a mechanic up at Carson City and ask him to drive the 20 miles down to Minden and help bail him out.
Gotcha. Here's a good question.
We've even been forced in some cases where an airplane was stuck at an airport with no services, and it went out of annual. We have actually sent 2 mechanics and a full toolbox on a pickup truck and done an annual inspection away from home. We don't like to do that. It's very awkward, but sometimes you got to. One of the things about airplanes that makes them different from most other motor vehicles is you usually can't tow them to where you want them to be. You usually have to bring the mechanics to the airplane rather than the other way around.
Gotcha. It brings up the next question here from Robert. Do some airports prohibit any owner-performed maintenance, even flat tires, because it takes away business from their sanctioned shop?
Well, of course they do. But I have never seen a case where an airport actually enforced that in a case that the aircraft was AOG. In other words, they have rules that would prohibit that sort of thing if it was discretionary maintenance. But if the airplane is stuck, I'm not saying there is not. It could never happen. But in my experience, the airports tend to be pretty generous when an owner is in extremis.
Gotcha. And let's see, Larry says a little off topic, but I'm not flying as much with the high cost of fuel and wonder how often oil should be changed if I'm only flying about 30 hours a year. He's an RV-7A builder, so it's probably like Homing 0320 or 0360, I would imagine.
If the engine has a spin-on full flow oil filter, we recommend, and the manufacturers recommend, that the oil be changed at no greater interval than 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. So even if you're flying 30 hours a year, they want you to change the oil 3 times a year, because there is a calendar time issues involved. As the oil, say you fly 30 hours a year, after you have 20 or 25 hours on the oil, that oil has a bunch of corrosive components in it, acids and stuff. And even if the airplane is just sitting there, you don't want expensive stuff like crankshafts and camshafts and stuff to be sitting in corrosive oil. So the recommendation is that you change the oil no less often than every 50 hours or 4 calendar months. And if you're flying more than 150 hours a year, then the 50 hours will come up first. If you're flying less than 150 hours a year, normally the 4 months will come up first. For those engines that do not have a full flow oil filter and that just have a screen, then the recommendation is not to go more than 25 hours between oil changes. But again, no more than 4 calendar months.
Okay, and we have a number of people that found the article again, and they say it was written date of July 30, 1995. There was a picture of Mike Bush, and he sure looked a lot younger back then.
Yeah, I bet. He had brown hair and, yeah. Yep. I don't want to know about it.
Okay. Okay, so let's see here. We do have a few more questions here. So insurance issues, Lawrence is wondering about, what about insurance issues? If an owner flies an airplane and then has an insurance claim because They ding it. Is it insured? Well, I would
Why
imagine
wouldn't
the
it be?
answer's got to be yes. Yeah, I mean, if you're flying the airplane, obviously you believe it's in a condition for safe operation and airworthy. So that's what we've been talking about here, is going through the steps to ensure that that's the case before you fly it.
Right. And you know what? Uh, the requirements for insurance to cover you in the event of an accident are basically that the aircraft is airworthy and the pilot is airworthy. And airworthy means what the FAA defines it to mean. So the aircraft is, you know, is typically airworthy if it's in annual, and there are no obvious airworthiness discrepancies that are sufficiently obvious that a pilot should be able to identify them. We don't expect pilots to make comprehensive airworthiness determinations. That's why we pay IAs the big bucks to do that, and we only pay them the big bucks once a year. The rest of the time we depend on pilots to determine that the aircraft is in safe condition to fly, but the pilot is not expected to make a comprehensive airworthiness determination. But obviously, if you know, if there's a flat tire or a big dent in the wing or something that a pilot should obviously be able to recognize, then he would be held responsible if he flew the airplane in that condition. And of course, the pilot being airworthy simply means that he has a current medical and that he doesn't have any known disqualifying conditions that where he should self-disqualify himself from flying. Now, different policies are a little different. For example, Avemco is particularly generous in this respect. Avemco is the only company I know of that only requires that the airplane and the pilot be airworthy, if you will, at the time the policy goes into effect. So if halfway through the policy year the annual expires, and then you have an accident with an expired annual, Avemco will pay the claim. Many other companies would deny the claim because the airplane was out of annual. But the way the Avemco policy is written, they only require that the aircraft be airworthy on the day that the policy goes into force. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is. Nice comment here from Peter. Peter says, I can vouch for Mike. He helped me out of a tough annual before I was even a client. A&P was holding my plane hostage, and he got me out of jail.
All right.
Okay, so good.
I love doing stuff like that. I really do.
Okay, so good question from Michelle. What are the most common problems that have grounded your clients? Common problems for older single-engine propeller aircraft?
Oh, boy.
That's a thought provoker there, I can tell.
Well, it just varies so much from one kind of aircraft to another. For example, as I mentioned, we manage a lot of Cirrus aircraft, and Cirrus aircraft are all electric airplanes, and so a pretty significant percentage of problems that we have with Cirrus aircraft are electrical related. They're charging system failures, where we have to diagnose whether it's an alternator failure, whether it's a, they don't call them regulators anymore in the modern airplane. It's called a field control module, but it's the same as a regulator. But we frequently have to diagnose why the charging system has failed. And the charging systems in Cirruses are very complicated because they have two alternators and they've got two batteries and they've got, you know, sort of dual everything, and so it's a fairly complicated system. But the good part about it is that the Cirruses all are instrumented up the yin-yang with their engine monitor. So typically we can get a Cirrus owner who is AOG to just dump his engine monitor data, upload it to our Savvy Analysis site. We can take a look and see what all the bus voltages are, what the currents are, all that kind of stuff. And usually just by looking at the data, remotely, we can tell exactly what the problem is. Or we can come very close to telling what the problem is. Sometimes it needs to be confirmed with a little testing, with an ohmmeter or something. But um, we love engine monitors because they let us diagnose problems remotely and non-invasively, and we really don't want to be taking airplanes apart in order to figure out what's wrong with them. We want to be able to do it non-invasively. It's like the difference between an X-ray and exploratory surgery. We much prefer the X-rays.
Yeah. Tom is wondering if you have any suggestions for pilots who rent aircraft.
Yes, save up your money and buy one. I'm sorry, that wasn't what you're looking for. I guess I don't really know what to say. First of all, my company's practice is dedicated to owner-flown aircraft, so we really don't get very involved in rental airplane. We do get involved in some multi-owner airplanes where 5 or 6 people jointly own an airplane and stuff, but we typically don't do rentals. We don't do flight schools. We don't do flying clubs for the most part. And so any experience that I have with rental airplanes is very, very, very old. I probably should abstain on that.
Obviously, just check with who you're renting with it before you go flying and make sure you understand what their policy is. Being their aircraft, you would want to comply with that, and undoubtedly it would be to contact them right away and seek their advice and opinion.
Yeah, but again, if it's a rental airplane, you don't have to agonize over this stuff, because typically if you don't feel the airplane's safe to fly, you call whoever you rented it from. You say the airplane is at XYZ airport and it's not safe to fly because of doesn't have any oil pressure, whatever it is, and I'm renting a car and it's your problem.
Yeah, right.
Which if you're an aircraft owner, you can't really do that. It's your problem. It's not somebody else's problem.
No, but that's the beauty of aircraft ownership too. Is this all comes along with the deal, and this is part of the fun of aircraft ownership.
You bet.
Tom is wondering also if you have any clients that own experimental aircraft.
We actually do. We don't really advertise it very much, but and certainly the overwhelming majority of the airplanes that we manage are certificated airplanes. We do have a number of RVs that we manage. That's sort of as far as we've stuck our toe in the experimental market so far. We are when we took on some RV clients, we basically told them they were sort of beta testers to see how things would work out with experimental aircraft, and if everything goes well, and it seems to be going pretty well so far, we might consider taking on some other fairly popular high volume experimentals. The problem that we have with experimentals is when we manage maintenance, we're the people who are doing the management and the troubleshooting are typically thousands of miles away. They don't ever get to touch the airplane, look at the airplane. Everything's done remotely by data downloads and iPhone photos and stuff. And we sort of rely on being able to open the maintenance manual and the illustrated parts catalog, and even though the airplane is thousands of miles away, we know exactly how it works and how it's put together and what the schematic diagram is of the charging system and all that kind of stuff. And with experimentals, it's really hard for us to do that because each airplane, to some degree or other, is kind of a one-off. So it's more difficult to manage the maintenance of experimentals. On the other hand, a lot of experimentals, I mean, like notably the RVs we manage, although they're experimental aircraft, they have a lot of certificated stuff. They typically have certificated engines and certificated propellers and usually certificated wheels and brakes, and those are all stuff that we don't have any problem with, because, I mean, a Lycoming is a Lycoming. I don't care whether it's in an RV or a Mooney. And it turns out that the overwhelming majority of breakdown assistance issues are engine related. And so whether it's whether it's an RV with a an O320 or if it's a Cessna 172 with an O320, it's an O320, and it's not a problem for us. On the other hand, if the airplane has a fuel system problem, that's more of a problem for us because we may not really understand the fuel system on that airplane. We don't have the diagrams and the manuals and stuff for it.
Right. Okay, Brian's asking, lemon pledge for cleaning windshields, yay or nay?
Good stuff, especially on the inside, because then you get a nice lemony smell in the cockpit. Absolutely, good stuff. I actually have a spray bottle lemon pledge in my wing locker among all the other stuff that I carry in my wing locker.
Okay, do you have any helicopters? Ed is wondering if you have any R-44 helicopters in your program.
We actually don't presently, but we would be willing to take one on. We do have one of our account managers has extensive Robertson helicopter experience, and another one has a fair amount. So although we don't presently have any helicopters in our program, we wouldn't have any problem taking an R-22 and R-44 on, because we do have the qualified personnel to do that.
Cool. And Ed just followed up here. He's wondering what the cost is. I guess something like that. He should just call you, go to your website and contact you to get more specifics.
Contact me via the website or drop me an email on my email address. Because we don't have any helicopters, we don't really have any established pricing for it. So if he's seriously interested, have him drop me an email and we'll figure out what it would cost to manage an R-44.
Awesome. A question here for Tim. He's wondering if you were able to do anything about changing the logbook entry that Mark had received to say something better.
No, we talked about whether he should try to push back on the logbook entry because it really was kind of improper, and we decided that the juice was not worth the squeeze. Basically, what I told Mark to do was to be very meticulous about logging everything he did with respect to the filter inspections and the straining the oil, and to include all of the photographs that he took, which he mostly took for my benefit, but I thought that they would be really good to retain those in his maintenance records, to demonstrate that he took all appropriate precautions to determine that the engine was in fact in safe condition to fly, and thereby essentially negating the nasty logbook entry that this mechanic gave him. The mechanic should not have done that in the logbook. I know why he did it. He did it because he wanted to cover his butt legally if the airplane crashed, and the mechanic is entitled to cover his butt, but not in the logbook. The proper thing for that mechanic to do would have been to draft up a letter saying, I have advised Mark that in my opinion this engine is not safe to fly without a teardown inspection, and he has elected to remove the airplane against my advice. Sign and date the letter, ask Mark to countersign and date the letter, and then just keep a copy of the letter so in case Mark crashed, the mechanic has a get-out-of-jail-free card. That's what a mechanic who was a mensch in this situation, who really honestly believed that the engine was not safe, would have done. To deface the owner's logbooks by putting that sort of thing in a logbook entry is completely inappropriate. The regulations do not provide for a mechanic to be recording discrepancies or opinions or anything other than a simple description of the work performed. And the work that he performed was he cut open the filter, he removed the housing from the oil pressure relief valve, cleaned and reassembled a pressure relief valve, installed a new oil filter, and ran up the engine. And that's what it should have said in the logbook entry. Anything else was editorializing and documenting discrepancies, and discrepancies are not to be documented in the logbooks. Only work performed is documented in the logbooks.
Great.
But again, it was pretty clear that trying to have a, I basically said to Mark, look, the mechanic is wrong, but as long as he has your cowling locked up in his back room, he kind of holds the cards. He's got most of the leverage. So let's just face the facts. Let's just do whatever it takes to get the airplane out of there.
Robert's wondering, do you recommend leaving logbooks at home and not in the airplane, or bringing them with you in the airplane?
First of all, logbooks should never be in an airplane, ever, ever. First of all, the NTSB doesn't want logbooks in the airplane because if you crash, they don't want the logbooks to burn up. You don't ever want logbooks to be in the airplane because if you get ramp checked, you don't want the FAA guy to be able to look at your logbooks without, making an appointment and giving you a week or two to go through, make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. We go further. We never allow any of our clients ever to give the logbooks to any mechanic ever. We have them scan the logbooks. We maintain electronic copies on our server, and we provide digital copies of the logbooks to the mechanics. And we require that the mechanics prepare their logbook entries on self-adhesive stickers, because we don't ever want a mechanic to be able to deface your logbook by putting an inappropriate entry in, and B, even more important, we don't ever want a mechanic to be able to hold your logs hostage if you get into a dispute with the mechanic. So if you become a savvy client, one of the rules that you learn on day one is you scan your logbooks. We put your scanned logbooks on the server. You lock your logbooks away in a nice fireproof safe, and you never ever let them out of your physical custody.
Great advice and a good question to end up on. We've reached the end of our time here.
Okay.
So great webinar, Mike. Thank you so much
you.
for the information. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for attending tonight. Mike's next webinar is going to be on June 5th, and it's going to be Help! My engine is making metal. So what are we going to do when we find that metal? So that should be a good, interesting one. Thank you all so much for attending. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your information with us tonight.
You bet, and thanks everybody for coming.